Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to the second event of the evening in our Words Across Canada series, hosted by WOTS Toronto in partnership with Word Vancouver and WOTS Saskatoon. I'm Rebecca Diem, and I'll be your WOTS Toronto host for the evening. WOTS Toronto is a festival of books, ideas, and imagination, but we're also more than a festival. WOTS is a community. We asked, and you told us what was most important about the WOTS experience: discovery, inspiration, and connection. Our community is creative and resilient, and we're excited to bring the word on the street to you in your homes. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land that you occupy, wherever you're tuning in from.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's my pleasure to be here this evening and hosting this incredible event, which is online for the obvious reasons. I'll introduce the three writers, then we'll have a conversation, and there'll be lots of opportunity for you to ask questions, which we'll get to at the end of the event. Michael Christie has written a collection of short stories and 2 novels. He's been nominated for many prizes, including the Giller, and won the City of Vancouver Book Award and the Arthur Ellis for Best Novel, and that was for his last novel, Greenwood, which came out just last year. Kerri Sakamoto's first novel, The Electrical Field, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book. Her third novel, Floating City, which came out in 2018, was a finalist for the Toronto Book Award and won the Canada-Japan Literary Award. And Doreen Vanderstoop is a Calgary storyteller, musician, and writer. Her short fictions appeared in Prairie Fire magazine, epifmag.com, and the Alexandra Writers Center. Her debut novel, Watershed, was published just a few months ago. Welcome to you all.
Thank you, Hal.
Hi, everyone.
Great to see you. There are 2 main questions in the title to this event, and I want to get to them pretty quickly, but I thought I would start so that people had a sense of where your books came from. Is just that. What was the origin of the story you decided to tell, and how it made its way into book form? Doreen?
Well, it starts quite long ago when I was a child living in Calgary. And even though I lived in Calgary and in the Netherlands, I also lived in a city, I developed a sympathy for farmers somehow early on in my life. And so every spring, I remember hoping that the farmers would have enough moisture and enough sunlight to grow their crops and raise their animals. And so as I got older and climate change sort of became a mainstay in the news cycles, I began to realize that that job of being a farmer would be that much more difficult with the challenges of climate change upon them. And so then the idea was born, melding those 2 issues together. So that was the start of it for me.
Kerri, your book isn't what one would call cli-fi, the short form term that people are using for science fiction around climate or climate change kind of novels. It does deal with the built environment, so we'll get to that in a minute too. But how did your book start?
Well, I think I've always been
exploring the history of my own community and my family as a Japanese Canadian, and the history that goes with that, from immigration to internment during World War II, and assimilation out east. But this particular story was sparked in part by a conversation I had with Bruce Colbera, who's a renowned Canadian architect, and he was involved with the redevelopment of Toronto's waterfront. And he told me about a proposal that was made in 1970 by Buckminster Fuller, the visionary architect and the inventor of the geodesic dome in Montreal, the American Pavilion. And there was this proposal for a floating pod in Toronto Harbor. And it was this was proposed in 1970 at the time of these fears of growing density in the inner city, and the flight to the suburbs was starting, and it was supposed to be this sort of utopian kind of community of affordable housing that was self-contained. There would be no cars. It was all pedestrians and bicycles, and delivery of supplies by submersibles. It was quite an incredible thing.
Seriously.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And the amazing thing to me was that this was financed by a well-known Canadian industrialist, and it was presented to Toronto City Council. So it got that far, and but of course was never built. So the idea of this utopian vision and this dystopia of the internment camps was really that was the basis for the book.
The two stories come together. With the technology we have today, don't you think it would be interesting for somebody to actually create that floating pod, and so you
Absolutely.
It would be so interesting to see, and an improvement. Sorry, on the Toronto waterfront, Michael.
Yeah.
Greenwood began very chaotically and sort of in a very disorganized fashion, which is usually how I begin a project. I had a number of characters in mind who lived sort of from current day to 130 years ago. And I was thinking about them, and I didn't know why I was interested in them. And I noticed they all had something to do with forests and trees. And it wasn't until, this is my cliche moment, but I had a sort of an epiphany. I was cutting down a tree. I live on Galliano Island. I was cutting down a small tree to clear a driveway that we were putting in. And I cut the tree down and sort of looked at the stump and saw the cut off stump, and I saw the rings of the tree, and I had a flash that the tree was telling its own story, and that the tree was a kind of biochemical record of its own life. And I thought, what an interesting way to tell a story. And so all of a sudden, all those characters who were orbiting me like satellites had a commonality and had a structure. And so I eventually turned those characters became Greenwood, and each of those characters are a member of the Greenwood family tree. And the novel itself is structured in this nested rings of narrative structure.
Let me just stick with you for a moment, because I'm curious about the notion of characters swirling around in your head, and you don't know what to do with them. And cutting down.
So am I.
Cutting down a tree in your backyard, or in your laneway, road to the house, gives you an idea that almost like geophysics, causes a coherence. Has it ever happened that you have characters swirling around and they just keep swirling?
In a sci-fi movie where someone goes out to walk in space and you see them just sort of fly off. Yes, I've lost many a good character to the void, the abyss. Yeah, but I think, as a writer, you need to be, and I'm sure Kerri and Doreen maybe have some experience with this, is that you become interested in certain people for certain reasons, and those reasons are often obscure to you. And the process of the writing of the book is an act of discovery, and a way to discover what it is about them that resonates with you.
Why are they there?
Yes, many characters have been harmed in my process.
Doreen, Kerri, any of this ring any bells, or you? I mean, you might have an entirely different approach and strategy.
No, it really does resonate for me, because the character of Willa was what really started this process for me. And for a long time, I mean, it took me a long time to write the book, because it was between the demands of life and working as a contract writer, freelance writer. And she would always be there standing in front of her log house, and it was like she's going, "Tell my story, for goodness sake, tell my story." And I didn't really have a chance to get to it. When I got to it, I realized that she was actually very prickly, and she was this sharp-edged woman, and she was on this really difficult journey. But I didn't really realize, and I wasn't able to really understand her until I brought in her son, until I was able to realize who she was through her interactions with her son. And so, he was swirling around, and I plucked him out of the air. and it was through that exploration that the two of them really became, co-tellers of the story. And they, in fact, developed equal footing with one another, as Michael says, as the writing went on. So, yeah, that really resonates for me.
Well, we'll talk about family too, because that's a commonality in the books, is the importance and the conflict that there is within families. Kerri, do you want to jump in?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like I've always been haunted by family ghosts, a little ancestors, and that really I just have had little, little anecdotes about, and they're really just almost like little vignettes, I should say, vignettes. And I really don't know the larger context, because I haven't come from a family of storytellers exactly, but, these sort of hauntings, and some of them I haven't, they float away, or, they become, your character. But what this sort of brought to mind to me is for the idea of embodying your characters. And I mean, on one hand, I feel like there's, like what Michael had described, you have these ideas that might begin in images, sort of, and little epiphanies, and then things start to pattern themselves in your mind and form a narrative. But there's also the experience that I feel like Doreen has talked about inhabiting these characters who are insistent and waiting for you. And it's almost like I've had the experience of feeling almost like, an embodiment sitting there and sitting at the computer, but that these characters want to inhabit you. And I think about how some writers have also been actors, and that, you know what I mean? So that those were two things that, occurred to me listening to you guys.
All right. So here's the question of the day. And it's actually, quite honestly, an impossible question to answer, but we'll go into it anyway. What, in your view, does the future hold for the natural world and our built environment? So that's a very open-ended question, but I have to tell you that out here on the West Coast, and Michael's out here with me as well, on top of every other possible plague that has been visited upon us, today we got moths. Well, not just today, but the news reports are filled with a moth infestation, which is destroying trees. It's crazy. Okay, what does the future hold for the natural world and our built environment?
Moths.
If only. Some of them are really beautiful.
Heat, lots and lots of heat.
That's what the future holds. Too hot.
Apparently, yeah. It's a huge question, Hal. It's a huge question. It's hard to know where to drill down into that. But I think I come back to the present first for myself. When you're talking about moths, for instance, we had a huge storm in Calgary on June 13th. Thunder, massive hailstorm, and it lasted about an hour, and it cost, in property damage and houses, it cost over $1 billion. Like, that's the cost of that one hour storm. Most of the huge weather, like extreme weather events that have happened in this country that have been the most expensive ones, have happened right here in Alberta.
Yeah,
So this is exactly. We've had the Fort McMurray fires, and we've had huge storms, and we've had tornadoes, and so it's very biblical here, because it does seem like, you've got these massive plagues kind of coming through, and that's the present. So I think the present, I think we're seeing the future. And for my book, I did a lot of research, into climate change and projections of the story sort of into the future. But what's in our future is a lot of what we're seeing right now. There's lots of evidence of what's going to happen in what we see around us right now. I mean, I don't want to talk too long, but one more example. The Thwaites, I believe it's pronounced, glacier in Antarctica. Like, they're discovering that there are massive under glacier ocean currents that are now undermining the bed of that glacier. And if it collapses, that's going to raise our sea levels by 64 centimeters. That's over 2 feet. I mean, that is astronomical news, and that's a worry right here and now.
And Death Valley just recorded, I think, the highest temperature recorded on Earth in the last 2 days ago or something like that.
Absolutely. California too, highest temperatures they've ever had.
Michael?
You may notice that my voice sounds sort of raspy, and yesterday, you guys won't know this, but the entire Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island has been swamped by smoke from northern Washington's massive forest fires, and Oregon's as well. And I made the mistake of going running, because I'm sort of a running addict, yesterday, and I came back and my voice was like this, and it's been this way since yesterday. So it's I've been touring a lot with Greenwood, and it's funny that people really talk about it, this massive calamity that I've imagined, the Great Withering, where most of the trees, the world's population of trees, die off due to fires, fungal infestations, insect infestations. People talk about it as though it's very cli-fi, it's very far-fetched, but yet, I mean, on Galliano Island, where I live, the Western red cedar, which is a tree that has been there and used by Indigenous people for countless years, are withering and dying due to drought stress. And I think the most unfortunate trick that nature ever played on the human being is convincing us that it's invincible. And more we're seeing its incredible interconnectedness and its incredible fragility in many cases, like with the moths, like with the droughts and the fires. And so I'm a pessimist, to be honest. I think our lives are going to be radically changed, and all we can do right now is mitigate and hopefully steer things in a slightly better direction.
I guess in a way, the built environment is less significant if there's not much of a world left. On the other hand, maybe the built environment is a way, potential little bulwark or way of dealing with it. Kerri, is there, do you have any sense of the built environment and where we might be going with that?
Well, everybody's scrambling for cottage country these days.
Get out of town, eh?
It is, yes, it really is, as if that's a real refuge, and of course it's not, right? And you two have done the real hard research around this, and I mean, all I can cling to is the ideas. I mean, I've been immersed in Buckminster Fuller's ideas, and in 1966, he was writing with great optimism about, well, the need for action, but also that was a moment of great hope for the power of technology to enable us to master our own, our destiny and the planet, and to really make a go of it, right? So that we wouldn't be in this situation now. And his idea was about the power of the individual. And I don't know if in the face of your pessimism, and I mean, which I think is warranted from everything I've read and heard, it's, that's what we can cling to, really. I mean, I don't know what will happen, like floating cities. I've been contacted by people who are doing work in the area of seafaring, these seafaring communities, and that's really what I make a kind of dreamlike reference to it in Floating City, about that this floating city in the case of some tsunami or whatever can just be untethered and loosed and set adrift on the sea. So, that's a kind of, but there are people who are really doing research into those seafaring communities. They're actually like these big floating, masses, structures.
Wow.
But I'm not in a position to offer any more hope than you guys who've done all this research. But, Bucky talked about the trim tab, which is this little, it's this tiny mechanism on a rudder of a large ship or an aircraft, and how with the minimal effort of one individual that could produce the maximum effect. And it's like someone like a Greta Thunberg, right?
Yeah.
And I was kind of briefly buoyed by this, hearing this interview with Jane Fonda. It was this feisty, amazing woman. And at 82, she's been protesting about climate change. And she talked about putting your body on the line, and how when she was doing that, she never felt more alive and centered in her purpose as a human being, like to step up. And, I don't know what, I don't know what else to say, really. It is very dire.
It is. And I'm asked a lot in discussing my book. It's like, well, Doreen, where's the hope? Where's the hope? People, of course, they want to see hope in the world. And I do believe there is. I mean, I hear you, Kerri. Things are, through my research for sure, and the news you hear every day, things are dire. But I think there is cause for optimism. I think our resilience is where our hope lies. And so our ability to make difficult decisions based on science, based on good science, and then to be able to listen to each other's truths, right? Listening is a really, really important part of that. And then being able to implement, really innovative and difficult things. So I think it's possible. One of the highlights of this whole process for me was meeting one of my heroes. One of my heroes is Robert Sanford, and he is a scientist, water scientist, world renowned. He works with the UN University on water issues. They actually, like when there are drought issues in India and Africa, they call him. He lives in Canmore, right nearby. So when I was doing my research, I read his books. I read a bunch of his books, and then I got to meet him. And we did a program together through the Calgary Public Library, which was just a dream come true for me. But with all the information that Bob has, he is very optimistic, and he rests his optimism in good science. And I want to read a quote from Bob, because I love this quote from him. He says, "Good science involves not just the sharing of knowledge about the world, but it is the candle when we want to see and be warmed by the truth. And if there was ever a time for scientists to be our heroes, it's right now." Right? And we all need to champion them and talk about the kind of truth they're telling and act on that.
Yes, absolutely.
Lovely way to cap that part of the discussion. So I think we have about probably 15 minutes of chat left. And I really did want to get to family, because family is integral to all three books. A focus on the family. And would it be fair if I layered on top of that intergenerational conflict? Would that be a reasonable assessment? Michael, we haven't heard from you in a while.
Where to start? Family is the topic that I will always return to. It's family, it's entwined in everything I generally read, everything I think about on a daily basis.
Why? Do you know why?
I came from a relatively dysfunctional family, I think. So there, as a kid, you become a detective pretty early, a family detective, in the sense that you're looking for clues, you're looking for explanations, you're looking for the data on, why your family's different than others. But also, in particular, Greenwood was written during a time, shortly after a time when my mom passed away, and then my father passed away during the writing of the book. And I also had two children. So I saw two people leave the stage and two people come on, which really powerfully awakened me to this sense of being part of this intergenerational chain and being rooted in a family lineage, I guess, in a way that I'd never been before. And so, and I became fascinated by, whenever I meet a new person, I always love to ask them about their parents. And I love to see those conflicts. Like, in my experience, it's often, there's a line in the book that the children of gambling addicts become accountants, and the children of couch potatoes become marathon runners, which I think is something
always oppositional.
I think so. That was my experience. And there's always the push-pull of becoming your own person and still being infected with the problems of those who've come before you. And that is very much a part of Greenwood. There are 5 different generations. And so that dance continues between each of them.
Yeah, I remember thinking a few things about my parents and thinking, I'm determined that's one thing I will never, ever do as a parent. I promise this I will never. And I didn't. I just did other stuff. That's all.
Or my wife and I often say that you go so far away to get away from your parents. Yeah. You come all the way back around. And you end up where you were. Yeah.
Kerri.
Well, I've always been interested in the sort of psychological residue of, intergenerational trauma, I guess is the term that's been used lately. But because of my family's experience during World War II and the internment and that silence around it, and how that's, and I've tried to understand how that was kind of affected my generation. And it's sort of, I don't know, it's interesting because my father just passed away during this time in April. He didn't pass away from COVID, but we weren't able to spend time with him very much. We just had an hour before he passed away. So it was very difficult. And writing his obituary and sort of trying to sum up his life. It was, it was just so fraught, of course, for anyone, I think. But I think because of, I think you know, when you have parents or immigrants who have had a harder life than you have had, and they have suffered to give you a better life,
you feel that weight.
Oh, you do. You really do. And you feel a kind of guilt, I think, even. And wanting to do everything you can to make their life easier and comfortable. But they're not really comfortable with that because, you know, so it's that kind of dynamic. And my father was really an example of that kind of person who was very stoic and indomitable but made the most of his life really out of difficult circumstances. And I think so I have to hold on to optimism in that way, I think, and the power of the individual, because he was like someone who lived by Buckminster Fuller's sort of ethos of an individual person, an ordinary person trying to rise above, and the racism that he you know, he had to live with, and the setbacks that he had. But yeah, and I think you know, also during this COVID time, my son and I experienced some anti-racism taunts on the street, and it was so upsetting to me to have my son experience this, because I thought it would be something that he would escape and that he would not have to experience the way I did growing up. And so I guess this has been the preoccupation of my life, really, about history and how you carry your history, and how you try to rise above, you know, just how you carry it. And some people don't carry it well, right?
No.
And including, you know, dysfunctional families, that family histories. That's something that's always been a preoccupation for me. So,
Doreen, family.
I have to ask the question, are there any other kinds other than dysfunctional? I mean,
there are no normal families.
There are no normal families. And I remember, you know, maybe when I was a young child, I might have said, oh, I've got the perfect family. But, you know, that illusion is, you know, it evaporates as we get older, and rightly so. Life is complicated and relationships are complicated. And so, I mean, that's just life. I really feel for you to have to experience that with your son, Kerri. That is really, really awful. It's just
and
awful.
with your dad. Yeah.
And with your dad. I mean, everything that your family has gone through, it's horrifying. There's no
but
other,
I do want to hasten to add that, you know, racism against Asians is, you know, it's due to, you know, geopolitical circumstances, economic. In this case, it's, you know, about the wet markets. Perhaps it's about that, but it's circumstantial, and the enduring racism for Black people and Indigenous people is a whole other thing. So I really need to add that.
Interesting. Yeah.
It is, for sure. I mean, talk about complicated issues, for sure. But I can relate to some of what you're talking about, Kerri, because my parents were children in the Netherlands during World War II. So they grew up during the war. They were, my mother was, you know, around 6 to 9, and my dad was a little bit older than that. And their experiences are just incredible. In fact, as a storyteller, I tell some of their stories. And similar to you, it's becoming a bit of an obsession for me, just because it's so important that we tell those stories, that we pass those on. And I've told those stories in schools, and the children are amazed, you know, that people ate tulip bulbs to survive. Like, they can't even fathom that, right? So those are just really important stories to tell. And I know that veers away from the novel and everything, but to bring it back to my novel, yeah, absolutely. There's lots of dysfunction there. I think, I mean, as in Michael's book as well, I think there there are, if not all out lies, there are half truths in every family, right? That we're all sort of a part of that history. It's a part of us, and you can't, that's just the reality.
The word secret goes with family so often. Family secrets, family secrets, family secrets.
It does, absolutely. And that was really a key part of the story for me too, that as I explored it, the relationship between the father, Willa's father, who has, passed away, but the influence that he had over his daughter versus over his grandson, it's just so, it's complicated the way families operate. People influence us in different ways, where, my sister and I can remember the same events completely differently, right? We have the totally different perspectives on the very same family event. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to explore that through story, for sure.
I think, Michael, somebody asked you a question. I think it was an online interview about intergenerational conflict in the sense of, hey, boomer versus, a younger generation. As the only boomer present on this panel, I will try to hold up our end of things. Do you get a sense that there is a greater difference and sort of friction between a previous generation and younger people?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I certainly don't have the answer to it. But my theory is that the middle class has been eroded and income inequality has increased so rapidly since, say, your generation and the millennial generation, that those generations are still butted up against one another. And I used to have this problem with my father, who came from a working class family. His dad worked in a grain elevator in Thunder Bay. He was the first person ever in our family to go to university. He got in with abysmal grades. He became a lawyer in Thunder Bay and, was able to put together an okay middle class living, certainly miles beyond anyone before him in our family. And I think my father's estimation of how easy it is to make it in this world, was a relic from that time. And I certainly felt a lot of judgment from him in terms of like, well, why don't you own 2 cars and a boat and 2 houses by now? You're 35. What are you doing? Right. And so I think a lot of that resentment stems from that friction that you mentioned between 2 radically different experiences of the economy, of the job market, of equality, of just life in general in a particular society. And so, but I really, that stuff really bothers me. I really think it's reductive and unfortunate that those 2 generations should be pitted against each other in such a way.
Well, and I do too. But you've actually really opened my eyes to something, because I think the tendency is, like your father and probably like me, for every generation to look at younger people and say, well, you just do it the way we did it. And we don't think about, going to school and graduating with, or I do think about, but $50,000, $100,000 in debt. In Vancouver, you couldn't possibly, even affording a place to live, much less buying a house, is crazy. So I can see that there would be some resentment possibly with younger people saying, you don't understand what it's like, what we go through.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lack of communication and understanding, and there's a certain amount of complacency on both sides to not understand each other's experience. And I think it's a shame, because it distracts us from the fact that the middle class in our society has been eroded and is going to be continued to erode. And for the foreseeable future. Even as climate change worsens, this is a part of my book, is that if you think that climate change is going to instill a greater egalitarian society, certainly in between countries and also within a particular nation, you're out of your mind. I think that it's only going to make inequality worse, and that's something that troubles me as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a little statistic on that note.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the point where my novel takes place, which is around the mid 2050s, the scientists are talking about 200 to 300 million climate refugees in the world, and with nowhere to go, with no place to go to make a better life, right? I mean, that's an astronomical number. So it's it's certainly not going to make things better. For sure.
I have a question for you two, because the whole sounding the alarm about climate change, it's like language and words have been ineffective, because this has been sounded, the alarm has been sounded for some time now by David Suzuki and others. And how did you conceive of that? The idea that the language was not getting through to people, and the inadequacy of words to convey this situation and the direness of it. And I wondered how you grappled with that or thought about it in writing your books.
Go ahead, Michael.
Sure. I recently, pre-COVID, just before the sort of official outbreak, I was in Adelaide, Australia, and on the tail end of the bushfires in Australia. It was a very sad and tragic moment to be there. And I was on a panel, much like this one, though it was live, and someone, people were asking me, about the future that I had imagined in Greenwood and what I thought, was going to happen to the trees. And literally the day before, Bill McKibben had been at this festival. And all I said was, you just had Bill McKibben yesterday telling you that we're screwed. And he's been telling us for years. And these people, we have the cogent, thoughtful, data-driven people. They have platforms, they're ringing the alarm, and yet people want to ask me, a guy who makes up people in his head and has them
and has conversations with them.
Exactly. Yeah, let's be honest. And goes running in a forest fire to answer these questions. And I think it's people are just willfully blind and are too complacent and are too uninterested in disturbing their immediate comfort to head off climate change. And I think it's insane, and it needs to be talked about more. Sorry, go ahead, Doreen.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an interesting question, Kerri, because it was about 5 years ago, and I had been writing the book on and off, and I was really discouraged about the topic because I thought, well, nobody's really talking about climate change anymore. Like, there was kind of this lull, and I thought, nobody wants to read this book. Like, nobody's interested. Nobody seems to be concerned about it. Of course, my concern had been increasing as I was researching the book. So I was reaching a fever pitch, and everybody else is going, yeah, whatever. So I was really discouraged about even finishing it. And then I read about Margaret Atwood, the Oracle of Dystopia. All hail Margaret Atwood. And she was at this literary festival in Barrie, Ontario, and she talked about Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. And she said, where are all the Canadian writers writing about climate change, the biggest, issue of our day and of our age, she said, in fact. Mm-hmm. And that was my clarion call. I thought, oh my gosh, like, Margaret Atwood is telling me to finish this book. And
you better do it then.
Well, I better darn well do it. Exactly. So then I started in earnest in this thing, and I went to Sage Hill Writing Experience, which is an amazing writing retreat. And I met Marilyn Simons, who was really excited about the story. She worked with me to get the story ready for submission. And then, you know, things just kind of ticked along, and Freehand Books, the wonderful Freehand Books, picked it up. And so, yeah, it was really encouraging to me that, okay, like the issue is not dead. Like people still want to talk about it. And so that's what I'm gratified by. Like, people are talking to me about my book and going, well, you know, I really look at the water in my tap now with a whole new grateful eye, you know, and I go, well, I can't ask for a better review than that. And I'm not a scientist. You know, I can't predict when our thirst for oil will die or when the glaciers will have been melted. But these are important issues. And from everything I've read and everything that Robert Sanford talks about, this is really, really important stuff. And we all need to be talking about it. And Robert Sanford, he's a scientist. He's written amazing books. I would highly recommend people read them. But he's the first one to say, Cli-Fi, this is a good thing, because this can help people imagine what that future might look like. And so this is a scientist saying, keep the Cli-Fi going, because that will spark people's imagination better than any textbook ever will.
Marilyn Simons is the hidden hand behind a lot of great books in this country. And I have the same, when you talk about looking at water coming out of the tap, I'm paralyzed by plastic. You know I can recycle some, but I hate it. I don't want it to come in, so I have to worry about how the hell I'm going to get it out.
I hear you.
Questions coming in. So let me read one. This is from Lise. Do you have an interest in setting more novels in the near future to play with and explore more of these themes? I can't.
I just spoke, so Kerri, go ahead.
Oh, I'm not sure. More of what I've been exploring, I guess, or the worlds of tomorrow. Everything is a world of tomorrow when you're writing. You know, it's like it's the day after tomorrow. But it's funny because Bucky has stayed with me a lot during this time, of course. It's like he's going to be omnipresent in my life now because of all his wisdom that I've taken in. And, but I don't know. I think it's inevitable that some of that experience for me writing this book will permeate my future writing.
Yeah.
But right now it's not specifically about that. I'm writing about motherhood. So back to family. All roads lead back to mother.
There you go. Michael.
I just want to tell one really quick Buckminster Fuller story just for Kerri, because she's such a fan. There's a guy on Galliano Island, an old hippie, who actually built a geodesic dome that he lives in. And I was at his place. There was a party, there was music, and I drank way too much. And he told me to sleep in the geodesic dome, and that I would wake up feeling completely refreshed because it channeled certain energies, and it would, essentially restore me.
No hangover.
But I can report that was not the case. I woke up feeling terrible. But it was it was an incredible experience to wake up in a dome like that. And I did a bit of reading about him after, and I gained a new appreciation for his quirky genius. And to answer Lisa's question, sorry, yes, I think it's going to be very difficult not to write about climate change for everyone. I think we're all going to see a slow drift for everyone because it's going to be unavoidable. So I'm certain that I will return to that theme again.
Wow.
I actually am interested in looking back for my next project. Historical fiction is another love of mine. So I think, just to do a little shift. So the world doesn't get too depressing, I want to look back a little bit. But I just want to say to Michael, the answer to the whole hangover problem is in the title of my book, right?
Okay.
It's rehydration. That's what it is. So I just want to.
I've tried it.
I'm going to ask one final question and get answers from each of you, and then we'll wrap up this conversation. This is also one of those very challenging, perhaps difficult questions to answer, but it seems to me that at the root of so much of what we are concerned about is greed. And because that seems to me to be behind the climate issues, the problems we have, corporate and individual greed. And unless we deal, and greed seems to be absolutely and completely built into the human being. And thank God there are many of us, I hope, who are not greedy. But what can we do, or can we do anything about that aspect of human behavior, which seems to drive so much trouble and concern and problems and angst? Okay, that was a nice conversation. We'll.
Well, I was just thinking that, and back to Bucky as usual, an inventor and technological visionary and inventor, such as him, who did not seek fortune, does not exist today. They're all, multi-billionaires. They're the richest people. In the technology field, all those innovators, they're all incredibly wealthy and hold, most of the wealth of the world in their hands. And we don't have like a Buckminster Fuller type, or we do, and we don't listen to them enough. And he was unique in that he preached a comprehensive kind of thinking. So he wasn't just about about science, or just about architecture, or just about, he had views, a worldview, and an eye to design that addressed all our social issues. So we have to listen to those people. But greed, I don't know.
Michael?
In my novel, I did a bunch of research on timber tycoons. There's a sort of a timber tycoon character in my book who is based loosely on H.R. Macmillan, who founded Macmillan Bloedel, gigantic wood products. They call them wood products. I love that company. And I just remember during my reading, I just remember becoming so disgusted by just the notion of unlimited growth and the notion of unlimited earthly resources. And, these men, generally, men like H.R. Macmillan, they cut forest like they hated it. They cut so that the earth has lost a half of its 6 trillion trees. Now we have 3 trillion. And just, I think that when you have an economic system that is founded upon unlimited growth in a limited environment, it's going to go to hell. And we're going to have to augment. I'm not talking about socialism or, I don't know what it's going to look like, but we need to change the way that our economy functions and transition to one that is based on balance instead of unlimited growth. Because we're a cancer now. We're going to kill our host.
Okay, Doreen, last word after that.
Oh, how do I follow that? I've actually been starstruck through this whole panel, because as a debut novelist, I'm just in awe of both of you and admire so much what you have done and accomplished. But I just go back to greed. The idea of greed, I think, is very closely connected to me to the issue of entitlement. And you know, the fact that we feel we're entitled to certain things, which is exactly what Michael is talking about. The resources, we're entitled to use those resources. They're ours. We should be able to do whatever we want with them, make whatever amount of money we want, and that displays itself in big ways and little ways, you know, big corporate ways and also little ways. Just a small anecdote from early on in the pandemic, where I was watching Gloria Gaynor do her advertisement for how to wash your hands, right? And she was singing, "I will survive, I will survive." So she's washing her hands and she's scrubbing. And all I could think about as I watched that was she should turn off the damn tap while she's washing her hands. So this is
wasting water.
Exactly. We should not feel entitled to leave that tap on when we're brushing our teeth or washing our hands. So it's in little ways like that. And I think if we can free ourselves from that sense of entitlement, and yes, it's not about, you know, socialism or whatever. It's about thinking about the greater good. It's about thinking about our neighbors. Hey, if I turn off my tap, you know, maybe my kids will have a little water left when it's their time, you know, to brush their teeth when they're 58. So anyway, that's what I would say.
Well, thank you all. I think Rebecca is going to swoop in from somewhere. Oh, look at that.
Hey.
We are top magic. And so I will thank you and just turn things over to Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Hal. And thank you to all of our panelists. This has been such a fascinating conversation. And I will say that there's a lot of crossover between Cli-Fi and Hope Punk and Solar Punk, which is like some of my favorite books right now, like God's Monsters and the Lucky Peach by Kelly Robson, Game Changer by Alex Beckett. There's like a ton of Canadian science fiction authors who are just doing amazing work in that regard. And one thing that I really like about like the kind of like hope punk movement that spread out of this is the idea that hope and optimism and being community minded is this radical act, that hope is punk. And I think that, you know, I take a lot of heart from that, especially given like the current situation. But your insights were amazing. This was such a fascinating discussion. It's going to remain up on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it anytime, again and again. I know.
Is there a way to take it down?
We can talk. But no.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you all again so much. And thank you again to all of our viewers. If you'd like to order a copy of any of the books by our featured panelists or any of the panelists in our Words Across Canada or City Imagined series, you can pop on over to the Another Story bookstore website at the link in the banner below or in the comment section. And coming up on Tuesday, September 15th, our next Words Across Canada event is in partnership with Wild Words North to discuss how children's literature can help us to decolonize with authors Christy Jordan Fenton, Rebecca Thomas, and Dr. Jenny K. Dupuis. Tomorrow night, next up on our City Imagines track, we have Catherine Hernandez and Pam Palmater on Narratives of Resistance. And of course, don't forget to register for WOTS 2020, our first ever virtual festival of storytelling, ideas, and imagination, streaming right here, live on YouTube, September 26th and 27th. So register for the event, subscribe to our channel, don't forget to like all of our videos. And yeah, we're going to be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. To support the Word on the Street and events like this one, please visit thewordonthestreet.ca and click that donate button. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening.